Okay, this is part 4. Yeah, part 4 of the interesting work of Robert Temple called A New Science of Heaven. And we are on chapter 8. And it looks like I'll go for another 2 chapters for this segment. Let's see. A little recap from the last video. I don't believe Temple gets quite into what the Birkeland currents actually are. I don't know if I'm just blanking out or whatever. That might have been because I was too tired last night, even though it wasn't that late. But he goes into the history of the background context for Christian Birkeland discovering basically that space isn't empty, that it's full of plasma. I mean, they didn't call it plasma at the time, but yeah, the solar wind from the sun, and I mean that was a part of it. But I think it's more than just the sun. It's all of the suns. It's all of the billions of suns that have solar wind and plasma and everything. So, anyways, without any other further ado, further ramblings, let's get into chapter 8, the cosmic web. In 1933, the Swiss astronomer Fritz Zwicky, 1898 to 1984, 1974, was observing the Coma galaxy cluster through the large telescope of the Mount Palomar Observatory in California when he saw an anomaly. He had been making calculations about the galaxy's luminosity, and when he compared his observations with his gravitational calculations, he saw that they showed wide discrepancies. So he concluded that unseen matter must exist there to account for the gravitational forces. He would call this unseen matter dunkel materie. I guess that's whatever language the Swiss uh, speak. Do they speak Swiss? I don't know. I'm just a dumb American, right? Slow boy with no whiteboard. Dark matter, in other words. As regards to dark matter, quote unquote, which would eventually become widely accepted in the scientific community, my position is that one does not need to invent strange new kinds of matter, since it is plasma in different states, gaseous, liquid, solid, etc., that is in the dark mode, quote unquote, and hence invisible to us. This fits perfectly with what we know about the universe consisting of 99% plasma, bearing in mind, too, how hard it has been to photograph or even find the Kordylewski clouds. Those pesky Kordylewski clouds, right? Or elusive ones, anyway. But what is important for this book and this chapter is that Zwicky produced evidence to show that space is not empty. Until then, outer space, quote unquote, had been assumed to be totally empty, consisting of a perfect vacuum, with the exception of the solid orbiting bodies such as planets, moons, asteroids, etc., within the solar system and stars outside it. In other words, no medium was recognized. What happened to Zwicky after his discovery is an example of how blind and stubborn ignorance can hold back our understanding. You mean it isn't just religion that's, ignorant and stubborn? Yeah. Well, let's not open that can of worms, right? Um, hold back our understanding because of the tactics of ignoring quote unquote new findings by the self-styled establishment, quote unquote. The expulsion of solar material into supposedly empty quote unquote space was discovered from observation in 1936, 3 years after Zwickie's discovery, by the French astronomer Lucien Henri d'Anzambuja. I don't know. I'm sorry. 1888 to 1884 to 1970, while he was using the observatory telescope in Paris to look at the fiery material spewed out by the sun. After Azambuja's discovery of the solar wind, astronomers simply ignored it, as they had ignored Zwicky. Many famous astronomers continued to insist in the most vehement fashion that space was empty, quote unquote, and this remained very much the astronomical establishment's position. There is, I mean, kind of sunken cost fallacy, right? Being stubborn like that. And just ego, I guess. Anyways, there is nothing like establishments, quote unquote, of all kinds to ignore advances and new findings and try to retain the status quo. And we must never forget that there is a status quo of ignorance, which is precious to the mediocre minds incapable of original thought who make up the establishment, quote unquote. During the early 1940s, Zwicky tried to publish further evidence that space is not empty, but publication of his findings was refused by every astronomical and physical journal in the world. He applied to every one of them. That's a little hard to believe, but I mean, it makes for a good storytelling, right? But even if it was just like 50 to 100 of them, that's still a lot. Anyways, the establishment derided and insulted him and closed ranks to try to prevent his findings from ever being made public. I mean, obviously, that's par for the course with the establishment. With the military industrial complex, I would say, not just the establishment, quote unquote. Finally, in 1950s, Wiki was able to get around the boycott of his discoveries only by turning to a biology journal, Experientia, which extraordinarily agreed to publish his astronomical findings so that he could somehow get them into print. It enabled Zwicky's ideas to be circulated at last, even if only in offprints from a biological journal no astronomer had ever seen or heard of. It eventually became clear that the censorship of Zwicky's findings had been illegal, especially concerning that his own observatory's committee had acted to ban publication of his findings in all American astronomical journals, which they had no legal right to do. Well, maybe it isn't hyperbole. This remains one of the greatest scandals in American science and also of Swiss science. However, the situation has become even worse today. For now, it is not only observatory committees that prevent things from being published, but also the organized and combined forces of the military and security and corporate power. Oh, there you go. I wasn't even reading. I mean, yeah, I already read this book once, so I guess I somewhat remember, but it was right there on the page, but just didn't look down far enough, I guess. I don't know. It was in my peripheral, I suppose. But yeah, the military industrial complex doesn't want to give away the secrets now, do they? Most scientists working on in astrophysics in America today have signed confidentiality agreements with military agencies, and a large portion of their work is kept secret under various security classifications, many of which are wholly unnecessary. If the scientists try to release their findings, they can go to jail. Sad trombone. Jail trombone? Yeah, sad trombone indeed on that one. Even when some such documents are released, quote unquote, in redacted form under Freedom of Information laws, the release is often only a technical. For instance, one relatively uncontroversial scientific report commissioned by the CIA decades ago that I wished to see had, as it had been officially released, quote unquote, some years ago, can only be seen if you make an appointment and go in person to the CIA archive in Maryland, where you cannot copy it or take notes. Guess you need to have a photographic memory or something. It is remarkable what a short time ago it was that all the world's scientists insisted that outer space was empty. In 1961, the French physicist Alexandre Dalvilliers, something like that, 1882 to 1979, published his book La Poussière Cosmique. I don't know these French words. In France, which appeared in English in 1963 as Cosmic Dust. This was certainly one of the first full-length books, and possibly the only one at that date to devote itself entirely to the subject of cosmic dust throughout the outer space. Writing his book, de Villiers, a distinguished physicist who had worked closely with Louis de Broglie, one of my scientific heroes, felt that he needed to keep explaining and almost apologizing for the fact for the fact that he was writing a book about something that not long before everyone was convinced did not exist. Here are some of his remarks. Quote, it was thought until recently that cosmic space was absolutely empty. Here's a link to something. I guess no, I don't want to click on it. My computer to freeze, to be honest. At the beginning of the century, 1900, it was still believed that interstellar space was completely empty and transparent. 20 years ago, in 1941, the space separating the galaxies was also considered as a complete void. 10 years ago, in 1951, intergalactic space was considered absolutely devoid of stellar or dispersed matter. The work of Zwicky with the Large Telescope of Mount Palomar showed that intergalactic space is not absolutely empty, end quote. Until now, there were two other scientists who clearly realized, even before Fritz Zwicky did, that outer space was not an empty vacuum. This information has come to light very recently from the archives of Sir Fred Hoyle, 1915 to 2001, which have been deposited at St. John's College in Cambridge. Chandra Wickramasinghe, I really still keep tripping on that name, Fred Hoyle's former student and his closest collaborator in his later years, has been going through the unpublished portions of Fred Hoyle's autobiography. I thank Chandra for sharing with me some sections of this material that provide this unique information, and I am grateful to the estate of Fred Hoyle for permitting their use. We learned from these unpublished portions that Fred Hoyle and his friend and scientific colleague Ray Littleton, 1911 to 1995, had together decided by 1940 that outer space was not an empty vacuum, but was full of gas, quote unquote, by which presumably Fred means ionized gas that we now call plasma. However, they went much further than that. What follows are quotes from papers originally written for a book that would be published in 1994. Quote, in 1940, Ray Littleton and I suggested that gas between the stars was likely in places to be clumped into much denser clouds than astronomers were then prepared to admit. We also suggested that the excuse me. We also suggested that the gas in dense clouds would be molecular rather than atomic, with molecular hydrogen the dominant component. These perfectly these perfectly correct predictions never did us much good, however, because they were thought outlandish in their own time, and 3 decades later, when observation had shown them to be correct, nobody remembered what had been said as long ago as 1940. So it goes, I'm afraid. The thought that molecules, even quite complex molecules, might be present in great quantities within dense clouds of interstellar gas never died away in my mind, although astronomical opinion through the 1950s was so largely set against the idea that to argue for it in the scientific literature became impossible. Throughout my career, I have urged fiercely against the refereeing system practiced by nearly all the so-called serious journals. Didn't Robert Maxwell have a hand in that, the peer-reviewed system, or am I just imagining things? Anyway, that's a side note. My opinions are admittedly colored by an intense dislike for being told by referees what I may publish or not publish. But this is not the whole story. The superficially plausible reasons for maintaining the system are false. The real reason for the existence of the refereeing system is that it provides the majority with a strictly applied censorship over ideas which it does not wish to hear. I mean, that's not surprising, given now that we're, what, decades to like half a century later. I mean, the book was published in 1994, and that's 33 or 32 years ago. Now I'm getting 33 here. But anyways, because in the 1950s, the seemingly respectable vehicles of publication were closed to the concept of molecules in space, I turned to the disreputable vehicle of science fiction. My novel, The Black Cloud, was written in an irascible mood immediately following an international meeting of astronomers. The novel had the effect in my mind of connecting molecules in space with life, although by imagining a life form very different from terrestrial forms, I was unfortunately off on the wrong track. End quote. Fred was not necessarily off track after all with the Kordylewski clouds, right? I mean, as he realized much later, the sad story of Hoyle and Littleton being unable to publish their views echoes the troubles of Fritz Zwicky in the 1940s. We will return to Fred Hoyle and his contribution to this story in Chapter 11. However, for all the importance of the work of Zwicky, Hoyle and others, the scientist who probably did most to throw light on invisible matter, quote unquote, in space and to prove that space is not empty was Birkeland's fellow Scandinavian Hannes Alfvén, 1908 to 1995. The Birkeland currents were given this name in 1967 in honor of their discoverer and called them by that name in Alfvén's article on the importance of electric fields in the magnetosphere and interplanetary space, which he published in that year. Alfvén's breakthrough was to follow up Birkeland's speculations by identifying plasma as the medium by which electric currents could travel through space. As he extrapolated what he discovered about the currents running between the sun and the earth, first to the galaxy and then to the whole universe, to the whole of the universe, rather. This breakthrough would lead to both a radical new understanding of the contents of the cosmos and also by coming to an understanding of the mechanisms by which plasma carried the currents and in turn the effects of currents of plasma, a greater understanding of plasma and its extraordinary properties. By studying Alfvén and his followers and their discoveries, we can begin to see how plasma in general and the Birkeland currents in particular are fundamental to the way the universe works. Because Alfvén showed that the universe has this vast network of plasma filaments carrying electric currents. He also showed that the universe is full of electromagnetic fields. In fact, Alfvén's electric currents in space produced a complex of and dynamic interaction of magnetic fields, magnetic currents, and electric fields throughout space. The charging of particles in plasmas in space by electromagnetic fields in turn modifies the electromagnetic fields. Whereas once a space was thought of as empty, we now know that at a subatomic and quantum level, space is a jungle of plasma highly charged creative ecosystem, a highly charged creative ecosystem with matter in the form of particles being one of the things it creates. I guess this the solar wind. Uh, let's see, figure 15. Upward and downward current sheets of flat electric current extending between the Earth and space was discovered in 2017. The pale current sheets show the descent onto the planet of charged particles, and the dark sheet shows the upwards ascent of charged particles, as indicated by the small arrows. Okay, so comes there, and it's like alternating almost. It almost looks like an alternating current, but maybe I'm mislabeling that there. Maybe small arrows. However, it has been well known for many decades that negative current pours into the pole in a stream. It is unclear why this is not also shown, nor is it clear why the current is rising from two opposite quarters of a ring current. How that is happening, what makes it rise, and what charge these sheets have. The same, opposite, much more clarity is needed before we can simply accept this picture, which must only be part of a much larger process which is going on and which requires much more investigation. Image courtesy of European Space Agency. Alfvén showed that a Birkeland current is a stream of either negatively charged particles, electrons, or positively charged particles, protons and positive ions, that can travel from immense distances through space, many millions of miles or even billions of miles at speeds not far below the speed of light. although along a twisted rope, quote unquote, not made of dense matter at all. This rope, quote unquote, is made entirely of the charged particles themselves and the magnetic fields generated by those streams of current. Science Scientists call these ropes filaments, quote unquote. When there are several of them seen at once, they are referred to as a filamentary structure. Sometimes they consist of substantial bundles of filaments and sometimes of only two, which are literally a double helix, quote unquote. Superconductivity is an extraordinary phenomenon, first observed in 1911 by which a current can pass through certain materials and experience zero resistance. Classical physics cannot explain how this works, and the quantum mechanical explanation is still not complete. But in 1970, Laszlo Solimar and Donald Walsh, two particularly brilliant scientists, clarified the nature of superconductivity to a large degree by pointing out that superconductive filamentary currents consist of a central magnetic field surrounding by whirling layers of current vortices. They they especially they specifically stated, quote, thus in a simplified manner, we may say that there is a normal region surrounded by a supercurrent vortex. There are lots of layers of such vortices, end quote. Laszlo, there's a typo. Is it Solimar or is it Solyar? I'm not sure. And Donald Walsh quoted in Laszlo Solyar's Superconductive Tunneling and Applications, Wiley Science, New York, 1972. The illustration overleaf of a cross section of a Birkeland current shows such layers. Birkeland currents are far more efficient at conducting current than any dense matter conductor could ever possibly be, and they have very little current loss despite the fact that they can extend not only across our solar system but across our entire galaxy and even beyond. Indeed, galaxies themselves seem to be linked by Birkeland currents. There are many photographs of Birkeland currents in space, and there are many on the internet and in books to which I shall refer in a moment. Excuse me. Like hiccups or something. I don't know what this is. The loops, quote unquote, that are seen extending upwards and outwards from the sun's surface and from the solar corona, which is far above the surface, are also Birkeland currents. They are sometimes called magnetic field lines, quote unquote, by astrophysicists, which is incorrect. They are actually the glowing traces of the charged currents themselves, and there are many photos of these currents taken from the International Space Station, which show a kind of eerie glowing green river running along beside the space station and encircling the Earth. Hmm. The charged particles that reach the Earth from the Sun are mostly positively charged, made of protons and ions emitted by the Sun, and they stream along Birkeland currents towards the north and south poles of our planet. They are literally space rivers of positive current streaming into our planet and into all other planets in our solar system as well. What this means is that there are threads, quote unquote, connecting the sun with all of the planets, and is thus in continuous direct communication with all the small fry, quote unquote, by means of these rivulets. Of course, the rivulets get all twisted and twisted up because of the revolutions of the planets, and sometimes the rivulets are shut off, and then new ones start up again. So crazy pictures. was figure 16 cross-section of a dense plasma Birkeland current captured on a photographic witness quote-unquote plate in a plasma lab in 2000. Headset shut off. Sheesh. Where was I? Captured on a photographic witness quote-unquote plate in a plasma lab in 2007. The circle of dots is overlaid onto the image to indicate the 56 locations of the apparent spiral-shaped paths of matter. Okay, I guess that's what these little things are. The paths, 56 paths. Where is shaped paths of matter? Image supplied courtesy of Anthony Perrott. Reproduced by from Donald E. Scott's seminal paper, Birkeland Currents, a force-free field-aligned model, in Progress in Physics, Volume 11, Issue 2, April 2015, pages 167 to 179. The spiraling currents counterflow. In other words, one ring flows left and the next flows right, etc. And the whole thing is spiraling forward towards you, looking at the page at great speed in a cylindrical skin, quote unquote, known as a double layer sheath, quote unquote. I mean, I guess it's like one layer, and then on this, there's some kind of thing going on there. Whether the picture could be more detailed or not is beyond me. Birkeland currents beneath the surface of our own sun are known to be 40,000 miles wide. As mentioned earlier, the ones linking stars are far larger, and ones linking galaxies and filaments to form the cosmic web, quote unquote, of the universe are so gigantic that they are much wider than the diameter of any sun or star. Many of these observed many have been observed and recorded by astronomers, including the Sloan Great Wall, a filament that is an amazing 1.37 billion light years long. Birkeland currents can also be microscopic. Our bodies are full of them. It is because of the nature of such infinitesimally small currents that we are alive, as we will see in the final chapter. I mean, I guess you could say as below, so below. I mean, in other words, it's to pointing to like a fractal existence. Continuing. The way in which the rope twist, quote unquote, to form Birkeland currents in a double helix shape is really rather astounding. Does this remind you of anything? Yes, there is a distinct similarity between the structure of the DNA molecule and a Birkeland current. Not only this, in my opinion, no coincidence, not only is this, in my opinion, no coincidence, but we shall see that since the 1970s, there have been cell biologists insisting that charged currents flow along the DNA molecules inside our bodies and that they are superconducting. Double helixes are not only carry currents, they transmit information. I think he might reference or quote Bob Becker, Bob Becker's work, The Body Electric. I mean, there's this. If this is the place, this would be the place to do it, or perhaps in chapter 11, or what the last chapter he's talking about. I forget if it's 11 or not. Anyways, all of this is getting us closer and closer to what I believe to be the nature and structure of a plasma body, and the reasons for believing that intelligence can evolve in plasma. But first, we must return to look in more detail at the way Birkeland currents function in space. We will see the current standard understanding of electricity and magnetism is still insufficiently developed for us to get our heads around it all, quote unquote. As one example of our failure to comprehend the great mysteries that surround us, I come to what we call magnetic lines of force or magnetic field lines. These are constantly spoken of by scientists around the world as if they really existed, but they do not exist. Just in case you think I am being fanciful, here is what John P. Colern and Anton Machasik say in their physics textbook, The Language of Physics, a foundation for university study. Quote, field lines are a fictitious pictorial representation of a field. End quote. Field lines are used in the way that contour lines we draw on maps are used. The real landscape is not covered in contour lines. When we climb a hill, we do not say, oh, I just stepped over a contour line, quote unquote. Similarly, magnetic field lines are merely aids to visualization, and they are not real. So where does this leave us? Didn't I say that Birkeland currents, quote, follow magnetic field lines, end quote? Yeah, well, yes, I was using a figure of speech. Now let us examine a bit more closely how a Birkeland current is formed and how it works. It all starts with a push, quote unquote, of currents of electrically charged particles emanating from a source. This push forward of the current is facilitated by what we call an electric field. At this point, I should pause to admit that although scientific talk on these matters is confident and well established by custom, it is often hemmed in by ignorance. For example, we don't really know what fields are. I mean, I guess Ken Wheeler has entered the chat, but we talk about them nevertheless until we find some other way of discussing them. I tend to believe that electric fields are spiral waves. So we have charged particles called electrons, assuming it is a negatively charged electric current rather than a positively charged one consisting of protons and ions, spiraling along, pushed by something we call, quote, an electric field, end quote, though we don't know what that is or what charge is either. I mean, this is some wild stuff. But to return to the questions of how a Birkeland current is formed, we do know that electric fields are always perpendicular to magnetic fields. These currents flow as if along a magnetic field lines, quote unquote, meaning they follow a direction laid out for them by a large pre-existing magnetic field. As the currents move on their merry way, each creates a private magnetic field known as an azimuthal, quote unquote, field along itself in a circular fashion, which is thus at right angles to the electric field, but parallel to the larger magnetic field within which these tinier ones appear. In figure 17, we see a drawing published by Willard Bennett from his book Fundamental Principles of Physics, written jointly by his colleague Hermann Weyl. Yeah, nothing to see there. Showing a section view of normal copper wire carrying electricity. Remember that this picture is a slice across the wire and its surrounding field, and the and that the wire is coming straight at you. The black dot in the center is the wire, and all the circles around it are the lines of force, quote unquote. Bennett describes the convention, the usual agreement, quote unquote, as he calls it, whereby, quote, the lines in this figure are drawn nearer to each other for positions close to the wire than for positions further out, which is in accord with the usual agreement to represent field intensity by the number of lines per square centimeter in areas perpendicular to the lines of force. End quote. The drawing is, he says, to illustrate the fact that, quote, the magnetic lines of force are circular about the axis of the wire, end quote. In other words, scientists have agreed to convention whereby the fictitious lines are drawn closer together to represent increased field strength and further apart to represent declining or weaker field strength. There are no real lines, but there is assumed to be a real field. Just as on a contour map, there are real hills represented, but their contour lines are fictitious indicators of height and may be bunched closer together to indicate a steep incline. Figure 17, Willard Bennett's drawing, the fictitious lines of force, quote unquote, are drawn closer together the nearer they are to the wire, the black dot at the center, in the center, to indicate increasing field strength. This is a section drawing, and the wire is coming straight at you in this picture. You pause for a little bit here. Okay, where were we? These magnetic lines of force are not real. They're just, I guess, symbolic of whatever is real. With regard to electric currents, the self-generated mini-magnetic field of each current then constricts that current as if it were choking it. The first person to observe that magnetic fields at right angles to electric currents displace the current and cause it to deviate in its course by a certain angle was Edwin Hall, 1855 to 1938. He made this discovery in 1879, and it is named the Hall effect in his honor. What happens with Birkeland currents surely is a kind of extension of this phenomenon of the Hall effect, causing a slight deflection of the angle. But obviously, we need to do a lot more work on this issue, and part of what needs to be done is to understand better the double helix phenomenon of the Birkeland current, as I shall now very briefly explain. The magnetic currents applied at right angles to Birkeland currents have the result that two currents running parallel to each other start wrapping themselves around each other in a kind of perpetual lovers' embrace. As we have seen, they twist up into a double helix and flow on like twisted ropes. These two surrounding magnetic fields join and become stronger as a result. This constricts and compresses the plasma of the double helix further, and at occasional points, nodes, special compressed points like knots, are formed by this inward pressure called Z pinches, quote unquote. in fact, having been discovered and explained in 1933 and published in 1934 by Willard Harrison Bennett. 1903 to 1987, certain types of the plasma pinches known as Z pinches are now generally called Bennett pinches, quote unquote. And plasmoids, plasma blobs, form at these points and begin to spin, thus attracting surrounding particles and matter, excuse me, and matter in space to themselves and forming clumps. These are essentially energy whirlpools or vortices. The current flowing through the Birkeland currents then continues to supply energy, which is called, quote, becoming a maintenance current, end quote, supplying energy to the spinning plasmoid, which goes on expanding. It was suggested originally by Alfvén that by this by this means that gigantic Birkeland currents streaming through space form stars and continue to pump them full of electrons. The pinches, quote unquote, can also create atomic matter, X-rays, and vast quantities of neutrons, large particles with no charge, called neutrons because they are electrically neutral, in a portion of the pinch known as the sausage instability, quote unquote. Well, that's a weird term. Weird, very weird terminology. At the Z-pinch points where matter gets sucked towards the streaming currents, a process called Merkland convection, quote unquote, takes place. This is named after the Swedish plasma scientist Gurun T. Merkland. The matter settles into layers with the lighter elements wrapped around the inner part of the cylindrical current, and heavier elements forming progressive layers outwards. The different elements are thus separated spatially and available for the formation of solid bodies in space in separate bundles, quote unquote, as it were. A theory of the electric universe, quote unquote, has grown out of Alfvén's work. It states that our sun has electrons streaming into its poles from gigantic Birkeland currents, and protons and positive ions then burst out of the sun to form the solar wind. According to this theory, our sun is powered by streams of electric currents from a filamentary web of gigantic current streams linking all the stars in the galaxy. On this view, Birkeland currents supply huge currents of electric power, and they are surging around the universe in filaments. The filaments that fill the visible universe are so obvious when seen through powerful telescopes, they have led to a widespread acceptance amongst astronomers of the idea that the universe is a cosmic web. The best practical reference source to turn to for a description of Birkeland currents in astrophysics is Anthony Perrott's book Physics of the Plasma Universe, which appeared in a much revised and updated second edition in 2015. Perrott uh, was a pupil of Alfvén's, and he is the world's leading proponent of and expert on the electric universe, quote unquote, theory. As previously mentioned, he is a very high profile scientist associated with American government agencies. Ruh-roh. For several years, he was scientific advisor to the U.S. Department of Energy, and he has been the acting director, National Security, Nuclear Nonproliferation Directorate. He has worked at Los Alamos on nuclear tests and is internationally renowned for his plasma research, and Hannes Alphen was his PhD supervisor. Here is what has to say about the electric power filaments that I have just described. Quote, the high conductivity of cosmic plasma permits electric currents to flow that constrict the plasma to filaments. These current-carrying filaments form transmission lines, which allows electric energy to be transported over large distances. Transmission lines consist of an assemblage of two or more conducting paths. Transmission lines on Earth used for communications and the transport of electric energy employ conductors that are usually arranged parallel to a common axis, i.e., side by side. This need not be the case in space and is often not the case in filamentary current conducting plasma impulsed power generators. End quote. Figure 18 is an image showing the filamentary structure of the universe above and the filamentary structure of the neural network below. We will see later in the book that a similar web exists in our bodies, more particularly in what we might call our plasma bodies, quote unquote. We will see not only can we be confident that all dusty complex bodies, such as the Kordylewski clouds, are filled like this with a web of filaments, we can also be confident that our bodies are too. The filaments meet and connect at intersecting points, which scientists call nodes, and interstellar space. These in interstellar these in interstellar space, these are stars. In intergalactic space, they are galaxies. But at whatever scale, the pattern of a filamentary web keeps recurring. Alfvén was, of course, the leading disciple of Christian Birkeland. He and Perret have carried forward Birkeland's ideas about Birkeland currents. If Perret's book is the ultimate Bible, quote unquote, for this subject, Alfvén's book Cosmic Plasma, 1981, is also fundamental. Alfvén and Perret in turn have a disciple named Donald Scott, author of the book The Electric Sky. Scott is a retired professor of electrical engineering living in America. My wife Olivia and I have been very pleased to get to know him and his wife Annis, and for me to have the privilege of speaking at the same conference with him on one occasion on the subject of the electric universe. As for Birkeland, he was ridiculed in his lifetime for his theories about the aurora and was only proved correct in the 1960s when satellite data became available to us. Professor Alfvén was also ridiculed for supporting the theories of Birkeland, which he did from the 1930s onwards. But he too was finally vindicated and was fortunate enough to live sufficiently long for this to happen in his lifetime, unlike poor Birkeland, who died prematurely. Alfvén waves are named after him, and if something is named after you, things are certainly looking up. Pause. Time and again in history, science seems only to progress via vicious ridicule, followed by vindication and reluctant hypocritical acceptance by most of the people who have spent years insulting the innovative thinkers. I mean, there's a Schopenhauer quote in there somewhere. Christian Berkland and those who have followed in promoting his idea of electric currents streaming through space have defined orthodoxy in ridicule and have put forward a far more convincing explanation of how the universe works. I certainly believe them to be correct. Here we go. The 99% of the universe that is plasma is not sitting there inert. It is fantastically active and dynamic. We and we sh- and we shall shortly see. Say that 5 times fast. And we shall shortly see that as plasma beings, we are part of that universal process. Okay, we got the one here. I'm guessing the top is the Brooklyn currents with these filaments and nodes and whatnot, and then down here is uh, nervous system, or like, let's see what the figure says. Figure 18 filaments are fundamental to the universe and to all entities. They carry current, and they can carry information in the form of signals. They can transport energy and so forth in the universe as a whole. They are everywhere. They constitute the major portion of the universe's structure, which today is known as the cosmic web. I mean, that certainly looks like a web, all right. The, Here we see two similar adjoining images. The top one shows the cosmic web of the universe. Okay. The bottom shows the neural network of the human brain. Both are constituted out of masses of filaments separated by voids and joined at intersection points called nodes. The cosmic web is called because of the web-like nature of the filaments, which many believe to be filamentary channels for the conduction of energy and currents across the astronomical distances. Some scientists call them Birkeland currents, named after the Norwegian scientist Christian Birkeland, which contains certain carrying double helixes spiraling toward and surrounded by protective sheaths. Such spiraling currents are sometimes conceived of conceived of as superconducting, quote unquote, meaning that they can travel without resistance at speeds approaching the speed of light. The upper image was posted on www.research.gate.net by astronomer Professor Oliver Hahn of the Lagrange Laboratory, Côte d'Azur Observatory, Nice, France, on December 2014, as figure 1 on page 2 of his paper Collisionless Dynamics and the Cosmic Web, from the Proceedings of the International Astronomical Union. His paper with the image is available for free public download. Hahn does not himself discuss superconducting currents or use the term Birkeland currents. The bottom image is created by Matt Lee and was posited by eLife Science Digests. Uh, elifesciences.org in an article entitled "Traffic Signals That Wire the Brain," quote unquote, the November 19th, 2018. As with the universe and its cosmic web, excuse me, the brain web of a human being displays filamentary networks separated by voids. and joined at nodes. Is the universe a giant brain? Is the human brain a mini universe? In any case, these phenomena are quickly or these phenomena are examples of fractality, quote unquote, a term arising from the study of fractal geometry, which which reoccurs of shapes are often, or hold on a second. Such reoccurrences of shapes are often referred to as the self similarity, quote unquote, of forms which the same remain the same fractals. I was so fortunate to meet this heroic scientist on one occasion and attend one of his lectures. There are many videos of him on YouTube, which I enthusiastically remember to all who wish to have their brains constructively stretched. And that's the end of chapter 8. We keep going with chapter 9. Let's see. We have all been told for our entire lives that the sun is a raging furnace blasting out heat and light, which keeps us alive here on Earth. The sun is supposedly so hot that nothing one can imagine could survive for even a fraction of an instant without being melted and consumed and annihilated within its inferno. The sun is conceived is conceivably hot is inconceivably hot, excuse me, inconceivably violent, inconceivably turbulent. It is like a great bully in the sky, roaring with rage and spewing out fire and rays. But this is not true, and nobody could be more shocked than I was when I discovered this. It had made sense to me, having no specialist knowledge of all the other aspects of the matter, that the sun must be the roaring inferno that was so widely claimed. And when I was told that it was powered at its core by the equivalent of an internal uh, hydrogen bomb of fantastic and gigantic size, which generated all of its immense energy by the power of thermonuclear fusion and kept us all alive. I saw nothing to question in that. After all, where else could that energy possibly be coming from? It must be true. But then the conventional idea of the sun began to fall apart for me as I discovered some very strange facts in recent years. The ultimate discovery I made since, which convinced me that, quote, nearly everybody is wrong about the sun, quote unquote, was the revelation that the sun is cold. What? The sun is cold? What are you smoking, bro? How can that be? Surely the sun cannot be cold. You can see through telescopes that it is a turbulent mass of fire, spewing blobs of fire into space, and it looks like a vast fiery creature gone mad. But no, that is not accurate. In fact, the surface, quote unquote, of the sun, the technical name for which is the photosphere, is only about 5,500 degrees centigrade. That is 5,780 degrees Kelvin, but I shall not use the Kelvin temperature scale in this book because it is less familiar to readers. Yes, that is hot for us humans. We would be burnt to a crisp in an instant if we were there. But it was not. But it is not truly hot. It is less than 4 times as hot as the inside of a cement kiln here on Earth, in which the limestone is roasted into uh, in which limestone is roasted to make cement, and it is only about a third as hot as the electrons in a neon light bulb. Electrons in a neon light bulb in an office. Furthermore, it gets worse. If you go down to into a sunspot, which is like a organic wobbling open mouth on the surface of the sun, leading down inside to unknown depths, our observational instruments have proved from a distance that the temperature drops to as low as 33,900 degrees centigrade. What? You mean the sun gets colder the further you go down further down into it instead of hotter? How is this possible uh, if it has got big if it has got a big hydrogen bomb explaining continually at its center? Well, the answer to is that it does not have a big hydrogen bomb exploding at its center. The real heat of the sun is found far above its surface in what is called the corona. There the lowest temperature is 2 million degrees centigrade. Sheesh. And it is believed that coronal temperatures can actually rise to several million degrees centigrade. No one is sure of the upper limit, though 4 million degrees are often mentioned, and sometimes 6 million. But even the lowest temperature, 2 million degrees, of the corona 350 times as hot as the surface of the sun, despite the fact that it is so very far away. Its lower limit is 1,300 miles above the surface of the sun. It extends about 1,300 miles above the photosphere to the further reaches of the solar system. The Earth is actually within the sun's corona, technically speaking, but the main part of the corona from the point of view of solar physics surrounds the sun in a vast sphere of fire which reaches several million degrees centigrade, as already described. Let's see, we gotta pause for a second. Now, where was I? The real heat of the sun is found far above its surface in what is called the corona. There, the lowest temperature is 2 million degrees. Did I miss this section here? let's just start from 3900 degrees centigrade. What? You mean the sun gets colder the further you go down into it instead of hotter? How is this possible if it has got a big hydrogen bomb exploding continually at its center? Well, the answer is that it does not have a big hydrogen bomb exploding at its center. The real heat of the sun is found far above its surface in what is called the corona. There, there the lowest temperature is about 2 million degrees centigrade, and it is believed that coronal temperatures can actually rise to several million degrees centigrade. No one is sure of the upper limit for through million, though 4 million degrees are often mentioned, and sometimes 6 million. Okay, I did read this. I really need to stay awake. My apologies. But even the lowest temperature, 2 million degrees, of the corona is 350 times as hot as the surface of the sun, despite the fact that it is so very far away. Its lower limit, its lower limit is 1,300 miles above the surface of the sun. It extends from 1,300 miles above the photosphere to the further reaches of the solar system. The Earth is actually within the sun's corona, technically speaking. But the main part of the corona, from the point of view of solar physics, surrounds the sun in a vast sphere of fire, which reaches several million degrees centigrade, as already described. If you were to travel towards the sun, being miraculously immune to melting, you would pass through the genuine raging inferno of the corona. Then you would travel 60 miles from a transition region into until you reach a layer of 250 1,050, excuse me, miles thick, called the chromosphere, where the temperature would be a much lower 35,000 degrees. And finally, after falling a further 250 miles, you would arrive at the photosphere, which I have already mentioned. The photosphere is not solid, so you could not stand on it, but it looks like a surface from a distance, and so that is why it is called the surface of the sun, quote unquote. And then you could make your way down inside the tube of a sunspot, which the with the temperature continuing to drop considerably until you passed out of sight, and after that, we have no idea what you might encounter. But the point to remember about this journey is that it keeps getting colder the closer you get to the sun. So clearly our conventional ideas about the sun cannot possibly be correct. The fact that the sun is so cold rather, and that the temperature drops as you approach the sun from several million degrees to only 5,500 degrees should be conclusive proof that the sun cannot possibly have an explosion going on inside. Water does not flow uphill. Everyone knows that as you approach a hot stove, you do not get colder, you get warmer. But so deeply wedded in but so deeply wedded are the majority of the astrophysicists to their false theory of a thermonuclear explosion going on at the center of the sun, a theory originated by Sir Arthur Eddington, 1882 to 1994, that they remain blind to the obvious. Is that Eddington that didn't he try to steal like some of Tesla's ideas or something? I forget if it was Eddington or someone else. Oh, what is his name? No, Edison. Edison, not Eddington. Getting my these guys' names mixed up. I mean, I don't know if Edison stole anything either, but he was in contact with Tesla, not this Eddington fellow. As far as I know, I haven't looked into it, but they seem like they might overlap. They're both this guy's talking about thermonuclear things, whereas Tesla was, you know, inventing stuff with electricity. Anyway, they remain blind to the obvious. Another point to keep in mind is why are those holes in the surface of the sun known as sunspots not only colder than the surface, but also dark? Surely, if the solar BOMB theory were true, any holes in the photosphere would be blazing with light, but dark. So there we have it. The only sure indication of what lies beneath the solar surface is that it is cold and dark. How about that? This is far from the 15 million degrees of heat and explosion of light that the solar BOMB theorists insist upon as being found at the core of the sun, where their purported BOMB is said to be going off. I say it that way just in case I don't know this word. I don't want to be saying that too often. Um, Even though these are not my words, these are the words of this is the writing of Robert Temple. It's not my own words. This is for educational purposes only. Before returning to the question of how the sun must really be powered, we need to learn a little bit about the solar wind, quote unquote, the solar wind. As we learned in Chapter 8, the expulsion of solar material into supposedly empty, quote unquote, space was discovered in 1936 by the French astronomer Lucien Henri d'Azambuja. Oh man, that's a hard one for me. Until then, outer space, quote unquote, had been assumed to be totally empty, consisting of a perfect vacuum, with the exception of the solid orbiting bodies such as planets, moons, asteroids, etc., within the solar system and stars outside it. In other words, no medium was recognized. I mean, there's more to that than even Temple would know about probably, if I understand some things. Anyways, however, we now understand that the solar wind consists of plasma together with admixtures of some atoms and a lot of dust, either negatively charged by electrons or positively charged by protons and positive ions. Thus, solar wind comes from the sun and picks up dust on the way. Although it has now been proved that plasma creates dust, as described earlier, see chapter 3, so that some of the dust in the solar wind is thus plasma originated. In other words, the sun is emitting in all directions a powerful wind, quote unquote, of plasma, which fills the entire solar system. It flows over the Earth's it flows over the Earth constantly, blowing against and around the globe, being diverted in large part by the surrounding Van Allen belts or magnetosphere, see chapter 4. But how long has this been going on? Has the sun always been doing this, or is it something new? And could it ever end? In 1977, Arthur J. Hundhausen, yeah, Hans, who was later to go on to become probably America's leading solar wind expert, published a summary paper entitled Plasma Flow from the Sun. By that time, there had already been 14 years of satellite data so that he was able to make reliable statements about the solar wind. He said that the evidence indicated that the solar wind had been blowing continuously for 4 billion years. That is a lot of wind, a long time span, and a very powerful sun with no end in sight. Unless you believe in the big crunch, then there is the eventual heat death. Then there is an end eventually in billions or trillions of years from now. But who knows? Um, in May of 1999, a very strange thing happened. For 2 days, the solar wind stopped completely. Say what? That certainly poses some problems for conventional ideas about the sun. Yeah, no shit. Did somebody turn off the central BOMB? How can you turn off a thermonuclear explosion and then start it up again in just 2 days later? Is it absurd? The orthodox quote unquote view of the sun at the moment is, as I say, that the thermonuclear explosion taking place at the core of the sun powers everything. However, solar scientists admit that if the heat and energy from that explosion are to reach the surface of the sun by what they call convection, the process of the energy rising to the surface from the core could take 200,000 years. According to the establishment theory, therefore, we are currently being warned by by radiation emanating from an explosion that took place 200,000 years ago. The results of today's core explosion will be felt on Earth in the year 2000, 200,002 and 17. There are many bizarre solar anomalies that are ignored and glossed over at the moment. For instance, every 2 minutes and 40 seconds, the sun shrinks in size and re-expands, or in other words, rises and falls by 6 miles. 2 minutes and 40 seconds. That's 200. No, wait. 60, 180. 222 seconds. Huh. 6 miles. Interesting. That's a long way to fall, and that is a long way to fall and a fast rise. There is no orthodox quote unquote explanation for this strange fact. Is the sun breathing? If there were continual pressure from a thermonuclear explosion at the core of the sun, how can how could that pressure breathe, quote unquote, every 2 minutes and 40 seconds? Are we to imagine a fusion process that has lungs? But that's anthropomorphizing it, isn't it? The solar wind is mostly positive in its charge. Positively charged protons and ions spew out of the sun continuously except for these these short breaks. It seems that if it sheds too many positively charged protons and ions, it stops for a few minutes until it recharges, quote unquote, and then starts up again. As we saw in Chapter 8, huge streams of electrons pour into the polar regions of the Sun continuously from immensely long galactic Birkeland currents. This continual inflow of negatively charged electrons provides the pressure to expel the oppositely charged positive ions into space, which form the solar wind. This This system of solar activity is described in quote the electric sun theory, end quote theory. It provides a way for the sun to operate for billions of years without the need for any central explosion at all. Although some atoms are known to be created by the sun, they are created under the intense temperatures of the corona, far above the main body. In other words, the temperatures needed to create the higher chemical elements. Hold on a second. Uh, in other words, the temperatures needed to create the higher chemical elements are outside of the sun's core body and take place in what is effectively its outer skin. This is like trees, the centers of whose trunks are essentially unproductive and simply inert wood, whereas the true life processes of the tree trunk take place in its bark. Another problem for the thermonuclear folks, quote unquote, is who refuse to give up their hydrogen BOMB in the center of the sun is what is known as, quote, the neutrino question. Neutrinos. It is admitted by everyone that there should be a very large number of the tiny nuclear particles known as neutrinos pouring out of the sun as a result of any thermonuclear explosion. But the requisite number of neutrinos has never been detected. Ruh-roh. This embarrassing lack of neutrinos is often a source of public anguish to many in the astrophysical community, quote unquote. In the next chapter, we shall look at more scientific discoveries which show the Earth's relationship with the Sun to be very different from what we generally assume it to be. And that's it for chapter 9. Somewhat of a short chapter, but I'm gonna stop there before I start falling asleep on this. Yeah, the sun. Very strange that the solar wind just like peaced out for 2 days. Like, what is that about? That is very strange. Although, where is it? For 2 days, the solar wind stopped completely. I wish you had a source for this. I mean, maybe it's on the website, since the sources aren't here in the book, or at least this PDF version of the book. But yeah, this is very strange things indeed. So that'll be it for this segment.